Hello, I'm Teresa Berger, and I invite you to ponder with me in this presentation the intriguing phenomenon of prayer practices that have migrated online into cyberspace, in other words. Envision a broad spectrum of ancient and novel practices of prayer that are now digitally mediated. From a simple broadcast of a worship service via the internet to virtual prayer chapels that you enter as an avatar. From apps that offer you help with very traditional prayer practices to virtual memorials and pilgrimages that you take online. From Skyped evening prayer with people far away to adoration chapels with live feed webcams. There are even communities of faith now that exist online alone. For example, prayer groups that meet in a chat room in real time, or communities that gather in something like Second Life, an interactive virtual reality environment. Why study these practices? Why do I think they are important to consider? 3 reasons. There are more, but I give you 3. First, religion and spirituality sites have actually been the fastest growing sites in cyberspace, surpassing in number even those dedicated to sex. One example, the Bible app, a digitally mediated way of reading scripture, has more than 100 million downloads. That puts it roughly on equal footing with Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So anyone interested in studying the impact of new media will have to attend to religious practices that have migrated online. Second, this migration of religious practices online is a trend whose impact is bound only to increase, not least because of the continuously developing and expanding world of digital communication technologies. Third, the simple fact that religious practices are of fundamental importance for understanding the world we live in today, including some of its deepest problems, I think makes it necessary to attend to these religious practices that are now digitally mediated. And I note in passing that it's by no means only Christian practices that have migrated into cyberspace. Ritual life in cyberspace is multi-religious, and there are vibrant Muslim and Jewish, Hindu and Buddhist and Wiccan sites online, to name just a few of these religious traditions that you can find online. Among all these religious traditions, I myself know the Catholic presence in cyberspace best, so that's what I'll focus on today. Although much of what I'll sketch here is applicable across all religious traditions. Let's begin with a quick look at the larger cultural context in which this migration of religious practices online is taking place. There are 2 trends that intersect here, at least for the Catholic side of things. One is that means of social communication have expanded exponentially in the wake of novel technologies in the past decades. The second trend is that attendance at worship, at least in the North Atlantic world, has declined dramatically. To cite just one contemporary statistic, 15% of young adult Catholics in the US attend Mass weekly. Roughly 75% use social networking sites. at the same time, together with these two seemingly inverse trends, another development has taken place. Practices of prayer and digital means of communication have converged in cyberspace. The spectrum is broad, even when considering only Catholic practices. The Vatican itself has been quite active in extending its digitally mediated presence. For example, the Vatican has its own YouTube channel. There is a Pope app that allows you to follow in real time the major papal celebrations. And Pope Francis has a Twitter account that has tripled its followers since the election of Pope Francis. Pope Francis himself also regularly uses digital communication technologies. He prayed, for example, via a live webcam at the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi. Now, Assisi is about 100 miles away from the Vatican. So the Pope used a tablet and then posted an online prayer at the tomb of St. Francis via this tablet. Believe it or not, there is even a patron saint of the internet, Saint Isidore of Sevilla, a 7th century Spanish bishop and scholar. And oddly enough, his feast day is today, April 4th. Now, these online practices of devotion and prayer raise some intriguing questions. At least they do for me, because I study practices of prayer and devotion, both offline and online. I want to walk you through a couple of questions that float around these digitally mediated practices of prayer today. The first has to do with prayer as a bodily practice and the kind of questions that raises when prayer migrates into cyberspace. Traditionally, Catholic religious practices have been considered as deeply embodied practices. That is to say, prayer is understood not only to involve an interior spiritual side, but our very bodies. One enters, walks into a sanctuary, kneels, sings, lifts hands in prayer, smells incense. Given this insistence on prayer as a bodily practice, some are deeply suspicious of practices of devotion online. They assume that such practices, because they are in virtual worlds, are unreal and disembodied. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. First, I think that clear and easy distinctions between online virtual on the one hand and offline real are increasingly difficult to sustain. People, after all, have integrated and assimilated internet accessing devices into daily living. And this is true also for practices of prayer. For example, people can now quite easily integrate downloadable forms of daily prayer into a morning routine. Pray as you go for MP3 players even includes guided breathing exercises. Clearly, this is not a completely disembodied practice. Furthermore, no website can be entered and no app downloaded without some bodily engagement. Like offline prayer practices too, online prayer depends on actual bodies. Their presence, however, does not neatly mirror offline bodily presence at prayer. So while online, fingers and eyes tend to be very busy, the rest of the body may be sedentary. On the other hand, the multi-sensory experience that is available in cyberspace and its bodily effects may at times be much greater than a routine, maybe boring, worship service or prayer meeting. And technological development is moving rapidly in the direction of intensifying bodily experiences and tactile involvement, for example, through such things as data gloves and surround sound and headsets. In short, online practices of prayer are not simply disembodied and therefore somehow unreal. These practices are enabled, after all, by the interface of a human body with an internet accessing device. At the same time, digitally mediated prayer clearly has its own bodily proprieties attached to it. These are governed by two things. On the one hand, by what new communication technologies have enabled and what they constrain. To date, for example, smelling incense is not an option when you are in an online sanctuary. On the other hand, the bodily proprieties of cyberspace prayers are governed by the particulars of the person who enters sacred space in cyberspace. A friend of mine who was paralyzed in a horrific accident can never again walk into a church. Sacred space online, on the other hand, is very easily accessible to him. A second question about prayer practices in cyberspace has to do with what kind of active engagement is called forth. The Catholic faithful for the last 50 years have been encouraged to practice full, conscious, active participation in worship. In other words, to move beyond simply attending and watching. Are online prayer practices reducing, once again, the real active participation of people? That's the fear. Once again, I think greater nuance is called for. Those who engage in devotional practices online are increasingly interactive participants, especially so since the emergence of Web 2.0. Let's take a technologically very basic example. Prayer in front of a statue or a cross on a screen. The person praying is never just passively receiving an image. She decides, after all, when to start, when to stop, whether to sit or to kneel, or to dance in front of the image on the screen, whether to play music while praying or not. Sometimes, indeed, these online practices of prayer offer a wider range to the participants than offline prayer practices might. Think of a person dancing in total abandonment in front of an image on her screen at home. If she did so in a brick and mortar church, she might get arrested for the same practice. Last not least, the network culture of cyberspace increases the religious repertoire of participants. They can now draw on quite different sources simultaneously, blending, for example, Eastern Catholic prayer texts, African drumming, and Salvadoran visual art, all in one. A brief last word on religious authority in cyberspace. It's a commonplace that traditional lines of authority and expertise have been reshaped in cyberspace. And this is true also for practices of prayer. Here, too, voices of expertise have multiplied. Such voices might now be those not of the Vatican, but of those who are expert bloggers or forum moderators. That is to say, people whose expertise is in the digital domain, not in traditional loci of religious authority. And that's exactly what we find online, a vast range of people with expertise in the digital domain, including when it comes to practices of prayer. There are those, for example, who will post YouTube videos of Catholic women's ordination celebrations, while at the same time you have traditionalist Catholics advertising chapel veils for women online. Religious voices, in other words, have proliferated, and that in all directions. I note in passing that this cyberspace has been a welcoming space for the religious voices of women in particular, and that against the background of male religious experts offline. To conclude, I come back to my opening question. Why might the migration of prayer practices into cyberspace be important to think about? I offer you one last reason, and it has to do with impact, which is the theme for today. The Catholic population worldwide currently stands at 1.2 billion human beings. How these people practice their faith is important for anyone living in today's world. Not only that, but the faith of these 1.2 billion Catholics will increasingly also be practiced in digitally mediated ways. I hope I was able to offer you a glimpse into that world. Thank you.